Everyone. This session is about accessibility testing, and specifically the title is the ROI of shift left accessibility and automation. How do you build the business case, I guess, for accessibility? And of course, we all know that there's a real compliance imperative at play here. The Americans with Disabilities Act in particular, as far as financial firms are concerned, has caused a number of major banks some problems because they have not complied. There have been cases brought against them. But of course, there's also very much, with I think something like 1 in 4, 1 in 5, Greg will correct me, Americans with some form of disability. There is a market opportunity in websites and mobile devices that are absolutely optimized for accessibility. So it's a big topic, a hot topic. We have with us today Greg Williams from Deque. And Greg is Accessibility Program Office Executive with Deque. I'm going to hand over to Greg in just a minute, but first, just a reminder, if you have any questions, please go to the Q&A button to the right of your screen, write them, and I will see them, and I will put them to Greg after he's finished his presentation. He is also hosting at the end of the day at 1:15 p.m. Eastern Time a breakout session, so you can join that and select that on your agenda, your timeline, top left on your screen at that time, and talk more with Greg. Don't forget also, keep looking at the meeting hub on the right of your screen, clicking on that just to see if you've got any connection requests there. With that, I'll hand over to you, Greg.
All right, Matthew. Excuse me. Thank you very much, Matthew, and thank you, Jasmine, QA Financial, for the opportunity to speak with everybody today. And as Matthew said, a return on investment of accessibility. There's a lot of different aspects of that, and I'm going to touch on a few here as we get started. But the one that I'm really going to hit on today is in the operational space. So this is assuming you've made the decision that you need to produce accessible content, which hopefully you've made that decision. There's a certain way to do that. Actually, there are many different ways to do it, but there is an efficient and effective way to do it, which Deque refers to as shift left. And so that's what I'm going to talk about. This will be a lot of information. So as Matthew said, if you have questions, we'll try to hit a few, but you've always got the meeting hub. If you'd like to hit me up in there, and then I'll remind you again of the breakout session when we get to the end. So the first thing I want to talk about is the market opportunity of accessibility. And this is where we refer to as the 1 in 5, or the 20% of people, 20% of the population, not just in the United States, but really worldwide, who have some type of disability or some need to potentially interact with your company or your products or your websites in a different way than you might expect. But here in the United States, we have some more specific numbers. We'll talk about putting together some census information and some information from the IRS. And we've seen that the total after-tax disposable income of the people with disabilities segment is about $490 billion. For a little bit of comparison there, the African American market segment, $501 billion, Hispanics, $582 billion, and that includes about 20 million U.S. working age adults. These are people from the ages of 16 to 64. So when you think about that market share that's out there, I don't know any CEO that sits around and says, yeah, I just want to ignore this $500 billion market share, and we'll focus on this other one. So we're not talking about a small amount of money here. And as you'll see in a minute, we're also not talking about a small amount of money in terms of what it takes to become accessible if it's not approached in an efficient and effective manner. So talk about the digital channels specifically. So think about that 490 billion. Think about people who are interacting in the digital channel. And we've done some studies, and I've got some other presentations that are available on deque.com, one of which I think I might have given to this group last year that talked about in operations trying in an omnichannel organization to direct people to the digital channel. Obviously, this is probably your most efficient channel in terms of doing business. This is why we see companies bribe us all the time into, I'll give you X if you'll take your notices of privacy, or if you'll take your statements paperless, because this channel is where we want to do business. And we saw through that study that increasing the percentage of click-in, so just moving 10% of your customers from your other channels, perhaps walk-in, call-in, or mail-in, to this click-in channel would save 78 cents per transaction. And so 78 cents per transaction, if I were taking a relatively small company, let's say you receive 1.5 million payments per month, transactions per month. If we switch just this 10% over, that gets you a savings of over $14 million. So again, by enabling this digital channel, you can see that return on investment there that you're getting just from the operations space definitely exists just in being able to decrease the amount of money that you're spending doing those things. The other things we see too is that from another study that we commissioned and talked about some last year, we know that internet users who are blind are calling companies' customer services department, and they're calling them over and over when they have issues, where they're unable to achieve whatever type of, purchase or a transaction that they're wanting to achieve there. It's multiple times, and many times they're calling even if they've already abandoned the transaction, because it's persistent. I mean, this is something that should be available to them, and they're trying to contact you to help them to get this done, but this is a cost to you. Every single call that comes in is a cost. So again, savings in those digital channels, moving things over there, are definitely going to help. And then we'll talk about the one that everybody talks about all the time, which I'm talking about third on purpose, because to me, this one falls further and further down as we think about the market share, as we think about the operational impacts of this, as we think about social justice and other things. There are still lawsuits out there, and lawsuits are still obviously burdensome to deal with. Some other studies that I've done have shown that, the potential cost of a lawsuit, you're going to have people involved at your company, lots of activities. It's a protracted response. Senior levels of your company need to get involved. And you're going to have some outside counsel. But we have seen that, those lawsuits can cost in activity up to $400,000 a lawsuit, even if you're settling for $20,000 or $30,000 for some of these what we consider predatory lawsuits. So that cost really is all the activity that takes place. And so a lot of people, if they say, oh, well, I just settled for $30,000, need to remind them that all the rest of that activity that occurred is a cost and an opportunity loss to your company as well, because they're focusing on this when obviously you'd like them to focus on something else. So those are the main pillars of return on investment. But focus on right now, I want to talk about that one that really, I think there's an opportunity for everybody to embrace, and an opportunity now for people to embrace, because the tools and the methodologies and the rule sets and things are there. Outside of software development, again, you've got that increase in sales and marketing share, the savings in those non-digital channels, and the avoidance of legal fees and brand damage. But when we start talking about software, where are the savings that we can find within development? So in the software development lifecycle, how we produce accessible content becomes important. Where we address it in the life cycle, where we find defects and contain defects. So if we have a design defect, hopefully we contain it, certainly becomes an issue. And why does it become an issue? Well, where you fix that defect, or where you find it and where you fix it, matters very much. Through a number of studies that have been done, and there's a lot of references out there that you can get, and we can provide those as well. We're gonna see that the amount to fix a defect or address a defect as we go through the software development lifecycle increases very quickly. So a defect found in design and perhaps fixed in design, so let's say something like an image that's not decorative, that's missing alt text, is typically pretty easy to fix, right? Because the designers should know. They say, oh, I've done the design review, I'm missing alt text, I'm going to fix it here. When we get to the next stage, it's going to cost a little bit more to fix. Now, why does it cost 5 times more to fix in the next stage development than it does in design? Well, because now you've got more people involved. The developer's not going to know exactly what maybe that text should be, so they're going to have to contact the designers back, and now maybe the designer has moved on to something else, and they're going to have to go back to project documentation and say, well, what should this be? So it's just going to take more time. Once you get out to QA, it becomes even more expensive, primarily because there's more processing. Now you're in QA, you've opened a problem ticket. With that problem ticket, you're having a triage meeting, probably involving multiple people. Those people are then creating documentation that gets sent all the way back to that poor designer, who now has probably moved much further on to still find out what that should be. And then if we get all the way out to production, things get very expensive. Now, we've seen different studies cost, from 30 times more to 100 times more. I'm not sure I'll ever, buy the 100 times more number, but the numbers we're going to talk about, we're just going to use 30, which I think is probably not a very aggressive number in this space. But even by just using 30x, 30 to 60 here versus the 100, you'll see very quickly the financial impact of these things occurring. And so why does all of this matter? Why does it matter specifically where we're fixing it? So we have a defect, we have to address it. Well, it matters because there's a lot of defects. So right now we're seeing the number of issues per page that we see out in there and that other companies see. So we've had some other companies, WebAIM, I think, is one that looks at kind of generally what's going on in the accessibility of content out there. But what we've seen is about 50 accessibility defects per page. So if I've got 50 accessibility defects per page in my website, then what I'm seeing is that those costs per page are increasing, and they're increasing quite a bit. So you can see with your multiplier cost here, when we're finding them, if it's caught in design or if it's caught during development, caught during QA and testing, or during maintenance, and again, there's those multipliers again, you can see the total cost of fixing that defect increasing. And we're using some standard hourly rates here. I'm going to talk a little bit about a case study of a Fortune 40 company, but let's just say at maybe $80 an hour for the teams that work on this, $500 to fix those defects could cost as much as $15,000 to fix a defect. So very expensive as you go up, but also, what does the real estate look like for companies these days? How many web pages does a company have out there? And you'd be surprised to find out that many times I might talk to a company the first time and say, well, let's look at your inventory of what you have, and find that there's not really any one person at the company that even understands everything that's out there. I mean, the web grew up as the very wild, wild west. There's lots of orphan pages. There's lots of broken links. Different things out there, but just doing a quick check using some Google Analytics here for these four financial companies, you can see, 41,000 pages, 65,000. This is public-facing primary domain, 74,000, 53,000. So a very large number of pages out there, which then really means that what this represents to us is an incredibly large problem. A problem up to $750 million. If you look at 50,000 pages in production, and looking at the costs across these various steps in the SDLC. And so that's why making adjustments to move them back, even if you're just moving back one from QA back to dev, can make a tremendous difference in the amount that you're spending in your projects, in the amount that you're having to address towards accessibility. In fact, we think, if you're not managing accessibility, that technical debt runs, as I said, into the hundreds of millions of dollars. But if you look at all the content and think about all the domains that are out there today, we're talking about $1 billion problem. And again, let's remember, we're talking conservatively. We're talking, a group that we're maybe, the $80 an hour is an average blended rate. We're only looking at 30 times more expensive for production versus what you see some things that are a little more aggressive than that. So $1 billion for large financial service organizations, yes, that's too big of a problem. So what we've done here at Deque is we're trying to, figure out what are the best ways to address this and address our activity towards those ends. So again, where you fix those matter. And here's your multipliers again that we've talked about. But we've also seen through different studies and with different companies that upwards of almost 70% of defects originate in the design phase. So back in that design phase, something happened. We didn't have a proper annotation. We didn't check our color contrast. Many different ways. The flow of the application, we might have said, we might have designed it with a drag and drop that wouldn't work for someone using alternative input. Many different ways that you can cause it, but about 67% of those originate in the design phase. So that means if we look at that 67% back against our billion-dollar problem, just in design alone, by doing design reviews and catching those defects at that point, we've got $700 million plus, and that's integrating accessibility into your design. So training your designers, having checklists, doing design reviews, making sure that your designs are very solid before you even start to write the first line of code is something that is very, very important to do, for you to do. Now, because I've worked in return on investment so long, so actually return on investment working in large programs was kind of my first love in Fortune 500 companies, and then I fell in love with accessibility about 7 or 8 years ago and have translated all that learning into helping companies with accessibility on the same scale. We have lots of models, so definitely thanks for all the models. And thanks for all the information we've collected. This helps us at Deque to focus on the things that we feel are going to help you the most answer this billion-dollar situation. So I have a case study that we'll talk about. This is a Fortune 50 organization. This particular one happens to be the Fortune 50, Fortune 40 organization that I worked for before I came to Deque, so I'm very familiar with the situation. We had more than 60 web applications, so about 2 years worth of data. Again, that cost $80 an hour that I talked about. This one happened to be WCAG 2.0 single A only, and this was actually in response to the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. So this was response by this organization to AOTA's first requirement of 2.0 single A, which I believe was January 1st of 2014. And the average was about 20 defects per page there. So with 20 defects per page, much less than the 50 that we're seeing now, just when we go out and survey things in the wild. But actually, when we looked at the real costs of what happened in that situation, they're 60% higher than our model predicts. So here again, I'm banging on this to say that, I don't want you to just take our numbers at heart. You can run your own models. You can look at your own information here. But even with what we have here, we saw in that particular instance, 66% higher than that model predicted. In fact, it was $10,630 a page. This was surprising to us that when we looked across, this set of content, what we had to do, how much that actually took to do. So we'll keep that $10,630 in mind, and actually I'll put it back up here in a minute, but we're going to dissect that a little bit. But I do want to talk about the success criteria and give you a few statistics about the success criteria that are going to explain a little bit about why we're focusing where we are and why these things are important to focus on to address this issue that I've illustrated. So in WCAG 2.1 A and AA, there's 50 success criteria. Now, those success criteria can be broken down a number of different ways to test. Deque has their way that we break them down. We actually know that at Yale University, they break this down into 86 individual checkpoints, but checkpoints, tests, success criteria, whatever you want to call it, what you're really trying to do here is you're trying to make sure you're translating those tests into accessible content, so you're meeting the success criteria within WCAG. But what we've seen here is that a lot of people are doing these tests in system QA, user acceptance testing, which is just way too late. And the reason that is way too late, obviously, is because of those numbers that I showed you before. We're talking about, 30 times more expensive, 15 times more expensive. Where we really want to try to address these things is all the way back in design. Remember the 67 to 70% number. But if not in design, we want to get them in dev. And I'm going to show you a good way that we can get them there and how we can move this back from where these things are currently being addressed. So back to that Fortune 50 organization, what's the solve for this? What would help here? What would have helped in this particular case and avoided this $10,000 plus per page activity that we saw? One of the other interesting things we see, and so because Deque has been doing this for a while, we do have access to some pretty good big data sets, big data analytics that we can do across there. And so when we look, we see that about 95% of the issues that we've found in real world assessments have happened across these 12 success criteria. So looking at these 12 success criteria, I can say, well, I can nail about 95% of everything I do right here with these 12. So when I think about where I want to apply automation, or where I want to apply some type of guided testing, or where we want to focus on, streamlining things, obviously we've got data that suggests that this is the place to do it. And so you definitely want to be strategic about your return on investment. And so our strategy for that return on investment is to design our tools, again, based on this information. And so you're going to see this chart several times, and I'm going to show you how we've addressed this chart through the various tools that we have. The first one I talk about is I want to talk about Axe DevTools. And Axe DevTools, really the goal here was to shift everything left in the most successful way we could using this automation. And so we have something we refer to, we call it Axe Clean. But basically it's using automation to say, if I haven't addressed everything I can in an automated way, why am I messing with all of the other things here, right? Let's knock out all the automation we can first. And so within Axe DevTools, and this is just an example I've just flashed up on the screen here to show you what it looks like, but it's an easy button, right? We've got a browser extension. There's integrated fixing instructions. But basically, you put the page in the state you want to test it in. You bring this up through DevTools. You push the Analyze button, and boom, it shows you the problems that you have based on these rule sets that I'm going to talk about here in just a second. And it gives you information about how to fix them. So what's the coverage for that particular tool when we look across here? So we've got to be careful with this. There's a lot of different discussions about what coverage is and what it isn't here. So in terms of the rules that are written for the Axe Core rules engine, it's an open source engine. We have lots of people who contribute to it. We have lots of companies who use it. And I know Microsoft is using it. I know that Google's using it as well. But there are rules for about 44% of the WCAG 2.1 success criteria. But again, using that big data analysis, what we've found is that it actually locates about 50%, actually a little bit more than 50%, but we'll just say 50% of the defects, again, that you see out in the wild. So not just looking at what we're writing the rules for, but again, we're going back to big data and saying, for the things that we're seeing, in the wild today, how much does this address? Well, it's addressing 50%. So I ask you to recall that number 10,630, and the reason I wanted you to recall it is because if we look at 10,630 per page in this instance, and we say that had they used Axe and become Axe Clean in this automated fashion, again, this is just pushing the button. There's no manual testing required. It covers about 50% of everything that's there. You get about a 54.9% drop in the cost of your page from that Fortune 50 example. So 10,630 down to 4,902. And so what's the takeaway from this situation? And obviously the takeaway is provide tools that support inclusive design. So inclusive design, automated testing early on in the dev phase. But you get to a point where you take some type of human interaction also that's going to have to occur to determine whether you have a defect or not. So again, we've gotten that 44% rules coverage. We're at about the 50% in terms of finding it. But now we have what we call intelligent guided tests. And you're not going to be able to understand exactly what intelligent guided testing is just from looking at this. And I would urge you to come out to our website or contact me, and I can put you in touch with some people to talk to about it. But basically what this means is that we're going to give you a set of things to do, a set of things that a relative novice could do. It does not have to be an accessibility expert. In fact, it doesn't have to be a developer. It has to be someone who can follow a set of rules and answer some questions. And through doing that, they're going to be able to help us determine if we have defects that we couldn't determine from automation alone. And I know it's really kind of a semi-automation environment. Again, we call it intelligent guided testing, but it's another way to improve the speed at which you're identifying things, reduce the expertise that's required to do that, and still get very accurate information out the other side about what you might be missing and what needs to be corrected on the page. So when we come to Axe DevTools, let's talk about coverage where it counts for this portion of it. So if I look across this success criteria, you can see that there's only one of those top 12 success criteria that has no coverage here. Otherwise, everything has some type of coverage between the AX automation, the intelligent guided testing, and the AX dev tools. And this is again through the AX core engine. So if I add on now the things that I can cover with AX dev tools on top of that, this brings me down even further. So again, here we see, we've got the $10,630 per page. We've took some of that off with AX, and now we're going to take some more of it off with intelligent guided testing. So a decrease in 66.5%. And so if I was able to make a business case and say, I found a couple of tools I can use here that's going to save me 66.5% off of my evolution back in that day for AOTA, the Accessibility for Insurance Disabilities Act. Number one, I would have fell out of my chair. Number two, I would have just run straight to the CEO's office and said, hey, here, I've got something that's going to win, go ahead and promote me. We're going to have a good time with it. It would have literally killed for this back then. But again, we have to learn these things, and a lot of partnership between, that company I was working with and Deque and others to develop these things as we go. So you can see if you're executing your testing in the correct way and taking advantage of automation, also taking advantage of intelligent guided testing, you can very much reduce the cost to produce that clean content. So in summary of all this, where should we be doing these things? What should happen through here? Well, we talked about how it happens now, and how it happens now is in the QA phase, or maybe things, but we don't want to do that. Let's really get back and focus on doing accessibility in the UI design. And then let's look at some accessibility, as we, create the wireframes. Let's look at accessibility in the dev sprint cycle as we reiterate. So let's use that easy button, whether we're doing it with the extension, whether we're doing it with integration into your continuous build system, or even at the end in a deployed system. A lot of companies, once you've got your content out there, you can use that same rule set to check things in production just to make sure that something hasn't slipped out there that you expected not to get out there. So big difference, 7 years, 8 years ago to now is that now there are tools, there are rules, there are things that you can use to greatly reduce your operational costs in terms of producing this content. So I urge you to look into this. I urge you to use this information that, again, is from real world data, from real companies that we've put together to help you show how investing in this line of testing is definitely going to help you and your organization shoot forward. And so last thing I want to leave you with is there is an Agile Accessibility Handbook. This is a free ebook available. So we've got a URL that you can go out. Dylan Barrell, our Chief Technology Officer, actually wrote the book. All the great parts in it are from him, and all of the terrible stories in it probably are from me and my experience when he's like, this guy at this company, no, not like that. But anyway, it's a great book, and I do urge you to get out there and get a copy of that and check it out. And definitely, get a hold of us to let us know how we can help you with this information and how we can help you to get to a better accessibility state. I've left some time for questions, I believe, maybe a couple of minutes, Matthew.
Yeah, Greg, we got a 1.5 minutes, so we do have to finish right on time. We've got a good question for you, though. And of course, anybody who wants to talk to you in person, face to face, can do so in the breakout meeting at 1:15 p.m. You're hosting a roundtable there, roundtable breakout session. Okay, so one question. I think you've half answered this, but it is an interesting question, I think. How about reviewing design requirements prior to the development from accessibility requirements? In other words, is there a way in which this your automated testing can feed back into the actual design requirements at the very, very outset?
Well, so there is a way you can do that. I don't know how many folks are familiar with IT Infrastructure Library, ITIL. There's a process to do that. Now, I don't know that we've quite got that automated yet, but what you should do each time is if you find a defect in, let's say, the dev stage or in the QA stage, that's under ITIL, that's issue management, you found it. You should use problem management to actually go back and find out what the origin of that defect was. And through that problem management activity that you can undertake, that hopefully someday we can start to automate, you can say, well, this is why that defect happened, because I didn't train the person properly, or I gave them incorrect information, or I don't have a step in the process or in the checklist, or we need to have different people involved in the review. So I do urge you, anything you find outside that, go back and identify why that happened, fix it, and then it never happened. That's called root cause correlation and analysis.
Thank you very much, Greg. We've got to end there. Greg, thank you very much.